Okay, this is the second video on using light AOVs in Arnold and Maya and bringing them into After Effects, but applying it to a slightly more complex situation. Here, creating something like neon lights. So I'll go through the process of creating these lights and how we might think about it. And if you haven't watched the previous video on AOVs, it will repeat some of those elements, but you may want to look at that too, just to get a basic understanding of how AOVs work. But we have an image like this of two separate light rings with neon lights inside. Now I will say that I don't think I've really figured out exactly how to make neon lights look like neon lights. This works pretty well for a flat object like this. For another object like a helix I tried it with, it was more difficult to have the illusion. And there's a reason for that. You can sometimes make this interior light visible itself as an object, which makes it look more like a gas inside or a can. But with the light effect that we want to bring over to After Effects, we can't really do that. So we have to find a way around it. I'll show you what I mean when I build this, but just so you know, I realize these aren't perfectly realized neon lights, but I think we're getting there. But what's the quality of a neon light? I think it's highly saturated and very locally bright, but it doesn't cast a big light. And that it has to be contained within sort of a glass bulb here, or a tube. So we're going to try to recreate that with some effects in Maya and to change some of the intensity and exposure settings, and using a light decay extra for the light itself to make it bright but fall off quickly, essentially. We'll also change some settings about what kind of light it's emitting, less diffuse light and more specular light, for example. But ultimately, we want to bring this over to After Effects, and we'll get something like this. This is all from a single image, a single render that contains not only the natural light in the scene, the default lighting, but also allows us to bring in the orange light and the green light separately. Well, we bring them in together, but we can control them separately. So for example, the green light, if I turn that off, it's not just hiding that object, it's hiding the effect of the light in the scene. So on the glass that it contains it, but also the glass that contains the orange light and the wall behind the green light. So these are based on light AOVs. And just as a reminder, an AOV in Arnold is an arbitrary output value. It's just a container that can hold certain types of data. So we have to figure out how to make this thing and how to set it up for export with the right type of custom AOVs that we saw earlier. So let's just jump back into Maya. Hide this for now. I'm just going to create a new one, but you'll see that my setup is pretty simple. I just have a wall with an AI standard surface in the background, but with specular turned all the way off just to simplify things. A single area light, and that's the light that's casting down on here. If I just solo the key light, you can see that this kind of diffuse light coming from above that's giving us these nice sort of liquidy speculars on the glass is coming from that area light above, and the rest of the light is coming from those neon lights. So pretty simple. So let's create a ring light again, and I'm making this easy on myself by using a ring light. If, like I said before, if you use something more complex like a helix, the effect breaks down a little bit, but any sort of flat shape, even if it's a complex path, this should work for. Just if it comes towards you, if it changes in direction, the Z direction, it might not work so well. But I'd be happy to be proven wrong. I'm probably just overlooking something simple. So I'll just take a torus here. I'm going to rotate it. Hold down J to lock its rotation in increments. Okay, and we want to change the section radius just so it's a bit skinnier. Just change this little dial sensitivity thing up here so it's smaller and we can have more refined movements. I guess I'll make it 0.15. We want to have more subdivisions along the axis, so I'm just going to type in 60 here. And the reason for this is because we're just going to duplicate this ring to make a copy of it that will be the internal gas, the neon gas, that will become a light in Maya. And you can't smooth those geometry or mesh lights, so you have to have the geometry pretty smooth from the beginning. So that's why I'm adding all these details. So now I've created this, and let's just call this demo class. And now I need to duplicate it and make a smaller interior structure that will be our gas rather than our glass. And if I just select it and Control or Command D and go to scale, and I start to scale down to the duplicate, of course it scales towards the pivot point, which is not what we want. Now, we could have duplicated this or made a brand new torus with all those other settings and just matched it, but there's kind of a nice trick for doing something like this when you want to sort of locally scale something. And to do that, you use the sculpting tools. So I'll just call this demo gas. We'll go to our sculpting tools here and select the foamy tool. Double click on the icon for the foamy tool. I'll reset my settings here. So what we're going to do is like flood sculpt this thing. And if we tell it to flood sculpt it inwards, it will just shrink it down locally. So we want to change this to invert, so it pushes it in rather than out, and change the strength to a very low value. I think 0.05 worked for me. It depends on the size of your scene, of course. So you have to experiment. And if I just click on flood, now you can see, sort of, if I get out of here and hit Q, now it just shrunk it down locally. So that's a good tip if you're trying to figure out how to scale down something locally rather than about its center pivot. Save my scene. So now we want to turn this central ring into a light. So we select Demo Gas and go to Arnold, Lights, Mesh Light, and it turns it into a mesh light. So now the Demo Gas is a group. It's got a child light Demo Gas. And if we open up the attribute editor, it has all the qualities of a light that you like to see. And we can change the exposure. So for now, let's just give an exposure of 5. Now, if I render, we're not going to see anything because it's inside this other object, which just has, I think, probably the Lambert on it. I can't remember. I haven't changed it yet. I'm going to delete the history on this. Delete the history, freeze its transformation, center its pivot, the trio of preparation. Okay. Yeah, it's still got a Lambert on it, so we'll just select the glass and right click and assign new material, shader, Arnold shader, AI standard surface, the classic. So we'll use the preset for glass, and let's just try a little render after we save our scene. Oh, it's already open down here. Did you change it? Update the full scene. Okay, so it's working. There's light coming out, and because the top surface is glass, it's letting the light come through. It doesn't look good yet, but so what we're missing here is control for how bright the light is, and also to make the outer glass look like a thin-walled tube rather than a solid piece of glass, which is what happens by default when you assign the glass shader to a single object like this. So there are two ways to solve this. Let's call this shader something smart, like demo glass shader. And one way you can give it that thin-walled look is to go to geometry in the shader and turn on thin-walled. So let's see how this looks. Sorry, this is so big. Let's turn on my resolution gate so I can just back up a little bit here. Now those other lights are actually shining in the scene too, so I'm just going to hide those for now. just so the renders are a little bit faster. Okay. I've noticed that the mesh lights make the system lag a little bit. I think it's the mesh lights anyway. Okay, so it's still a really bright light. It's kind of hard to tell if it's acting like a tube. So let's change a couple of things. Let's select this light and yeah, it's this kind of slow. Let's stop this render. Okay, that looks a little bit better. So now with the thin walled, you can actually see that it's separated from the glass here. Let's just select a small area, hold down Shift and drag. You can see that's looking pretty good. Now, it's very bright, but if I turn down the exposure, it gets too dim. So the thing with a neon light, it's got to be super bright. The gas is really bright, but the light that it casts doesn't go that far. And the best way I've kind of found to do that, well, there are two ways. You can turn on light visible here, so it makes the light itself, the light source, visible as a bright object. And that works really well, except that when we try to use our light AOVs to control the light separately, let's say we turn, this is a blue light, and we turn that blue light down all the way, we still see this visible light in the middle as like a black object. So we can't really use the light visible here. So we've got to find a way around that. So what's the way around that? Well, what I found was if we turn the intensity up really high, like 200 or something, that's probably a little too high, and turn the exposure down, then we still have the feeling of the bright center part. 200 may be too much. But also, in the light, I turn down the diffuse amount that it's casting. So it's really bright on the glass, like it creates really bright speculars, but it doesn't cast such bright light around it. Let's give this light a color. I think we're going to make it blue. Yeah, that looks better. We can kind of see it. So with diffuse all the way up, I mean, that still looks pretty good. And maybe we don't need to do that, but we can try. But the light kind of goes, we're using a really high intensity to get this center part really bright looking, but it makes the light go too far. I'm going to make this little area bigger. It's just casting a little bit too much light into the scene. So one thing you can do is add a light filter. So this is in that mesh light. Click on add and we'll choose a light decay and double click on that, and we can use far attenuation. Turn that on and it all disappears because it starts at 0 and it ends at 0. So the light's not allowed to travel anywhere. But if we set the far start to, well, let's just leave it at 0 and set the far end to 1, let's say. Now the light can be emitted really brightly, but then fall off really quickly. So we could even change this so it's a little farther. At the scale of my scene, even I think this is too much. That's at 0.5, like that's not far enough. Okay, let's just leave it at 1. That was pretty good. You get this sort of kind of artificial donut ring, and this is the reason I also have it against a wall. You'll notice the real neon signs, they're built against walls and backdrops and signs because the light doesn't seem to travel very far, but it lights up the shape right behind it. So let's just see the whole scene here. Okay, that's looking pretty good, I guess. I kind of feel like it's got to be even brighter in the middle. So let's go back to the light. Oh, and I have my diffuse all the way up. So if I reduce the diffuse, start the render again, then we can control how bright the light is hitting the wall there. So remember the glass tube around it has no diffuse. It's just got specular and transmission. So I can reduce that, and let's say I turn the intensity up to 200. And we're still getting that blue, but we're getting a really bright middle. One thing I'd like to figure out is how to make this look cloudier. I tried putting some 3D noises on here on the intensity. I tried it on the color, I tried it on the exposure, and I couldn't get good results. So, but there's probably a way to do that. There's probably a whole different way to approach this problem. But anyway, so this is working pretty well. This is using the thin glass option here. I'm going to show you the other option that also works, that maybe gives you a little more control. So turn off thin walled for the glass, and if I refresh again, now it doesn't look like it's a hollow tube. It looks like it's a solid piece of glass with a light inside, not what we want. So what we can do instead is extrude out some thickness. So if I go to face and select all the faces here, I'm just going to double check in my modeling toolkit that camera base selection is turned off, so I get all the faces. And then in the modeling toolkit, click extrude, and then just turn up the thickness a little bit, just a tiny. I've got 0.01. Maybe that's too little, I don't know. But we won't delete history. We can always go back and change that if we need to. I just hit 3 on the keyboard to smooth it out a bit. So let's see how this looks. So this is without the thin walled setting, but instead we've extruded the faces of the glass ring. Let's save our scene. Yeah, so I kind of like the way that looks too. So I think either one will work well. Now, one thing we probably want to do here in that glass, under the attribute editor, in the shader, under advanced, I'm going to turn off internal reflections. Yeah, because what you tend to get is the light bouncing around, and just there's highlights everywhere on the inside of the object too. So by turning that off, you kind of simplify things a little bit. So we can take a look at what this glass looks like with the light turned off. So we can just turn the intensity down to 0. Right, so it looks nice here. It's getting a good reflection here from the light above. Now, one thing to note that often happens, sometimes when you extrude inward rather than outward, and that can result in the normals being reversed. So if things aren't looking the way you think they should look, select your geometry and go to Display, Polygons, Face Normals, and all these lines should be pointing out. Now, it can be a little misleading because if they're too long, it's hard to tell whether they're coming from the inside wall or the outside wall. So what we're going to do is go to Display, Polygons, right down to the bottom, Custom Polygon Display, and we can say we want to see face normals, and the normal size we want to be very low, and apply that, even lower, apply that. And we have the wrong thing selected, so let's apply that again. Display, polygons, custom polygon display, apply. Let's try this one more time. Oh, did I make this too small? Bear with me as I struggle. Oh, I didn't have the wrong thing selected. So we just want to make sure, yeah, so like this normal is coming from the outside surface here. It's a little hard to see. If I go into shaded mode, you can see these normals are coming right outside of the faces. If it was reversed, and I'll just reverse it quickly so you can see, it would appear black and the normals would look slightly different. Like they were actually, it looks exactly the same right now, but always check that to make sure that that's not the issue with your your render. Sometimes when glass doesn't seem to be reflecting properly, it's because the normals weren't reversed properly, or they were reversed inadvertently. Okay, we're at 20 minutes. It's getting a little long. So let's turn our light back on to this super high value. Check our Arnold render again, just one more time. Okay, so that's looking okay. Again, it's a little too perfect for me. I wish I could make that gas look a little bit more like gas, but for the purposes of what we're trying to do here, I think this is just fine. So the thing we have to do now in this light, so we're in the blue light here in the attribute editor, under the visibility section, AOV light group, we have to give it a name. So we're going to call this one blue, because that's the name that the AOV will be given when we write it out into the file that we want for After Effects. Now the other lights that I've created previously already have names, so let's put them all together. I think they might be intersecting each other a little bit, so let's just rotate it a tad. And let's turn those other lights that I hid earlier back on. And we'll save our scene. Do a quick render. All right, so now we get nice interaction of all these things. You can see that maybe I made these ones a little bit differently. They're a little less opaque than this one. So it's all down to the intensity settings, the exposure settings, and so on. I'm just going to stop this. I'm going to add an imager. So you can see I've done it many times already. Add a light mixer. Now there are some other, because this is a scene that I was building up over time, you can see that I've got like a red one. I used to have a red light. There's the key light here. There's the default light. There used to be a HDR image in the background. That was the default light. So some of these things are left over. But what you should see are the names that you gave the AOV light group. So there's the blue one that I just made. Previously I made green, red, and orange. And in fact, I think I might have reversed these values. So not to be too confusing, but you'll see what I mean in a second. So there's a lot to calculate here, so it's just taking a little while to go through. I still have it at quite low settings in order to be a little quicker than it otherwise would be, but you can see some graininess on the wall in the diffuse light, but that's okay. Let me just pause while this finishes. Okay, it's finished rendering. And now that it's finished rendering, we should be able to adjust these settings here. So now I can dial the blue up or down. So when I want the light to be off, it can be at intensity of 0. I can turn this up. You can also adjust the exposure here too. Then the green. Okay, I did name it properly. You can adjust this one, the orange. And then my key light is that I can just solo that, but I put it to 0. So that's this sort of general room light from above. So I can solo that, or I can turn it off. I can turn the blue off entirely. So this is the kind of control we want to bring into After Effects. But we don't use the imager to do this. This is just for previewing it. I'm going to reset all these and remove the imager. So the last thing we have to do is, in Maya at least, I'm just going to stop this render. Well, I'll let it go in the background. Actually, no, it's going to keep updating. I'll render off screen in a second. So we have to go to the render settings under AOVs. Now, we have to make sure that we're exporting as an EXR with half precision to make a smaller file, but still with lots of editability. Tiled is the default, and turn on merge AOVs. Then everything else, you can do whatever you want. And then under AOVs, we have to create, in this case, four custom AOVs. So we want to add a custom AOV for the blue light that we just created, and we call that RGBA capitalized underscore BLUE with the capitalization sensitivity. So I keep it lowercase here. Don't click delete all. RGBA blue. Add custom RGBA orange. Add custom RGBA green. And then the other one I had was called key. So RGBA underscore key. And just as a reminder, if I select my area light and look at it in the attribute editor, AOV light group is set to key here. So that's the name you want to match after RGBA underscore. Here, let's save our scene. And now I'll just render this one more time and then we'll see those things. So render, update full scene, and just let it go. I'll pause the video while that happens. Okay, the render's done. Took a couple of minutes. I'm rendering at some bizarre size here. Anyway, so now normally in the render settings, you would be rendering out a sequence of these, changing all of this stuff here. And so as long as all of this is set, merge AOVs, have precision EXR, then it'll all work in the same way. Just for convenience, I'm going to save out of the Arnold render view, file, save multi-layered EXR, and I'll call this 3 rings. And we'll go into After Effects. Here we've got the previous one. And in the project windows, double click and we'll import that. And we'll just drag that onto a composition. Now one thing you want to make sure, yes, it's a strange size. If we go to File, Project Settings, Color, yeah, so I think by default it should be 32-bit, but if it's not, it might be on 8-bit. You want to have it at least 16-bit. We can put it to 32-bit here. And you can look at the file itself that you just brought in. If you right-click, Interpret Footage Main, and there's nothing really to change here. This is the assigned profile that it started with. But so this looks good, looks just like the render. But now if we want to separate out these different colors, we have to go through the process I explained in the previous video, so I'll do it quickly. I'll just duplicate this so we have an unblemished one at the bottom that we can always turn back to. And we're going to add an effect, right click, Effect, 3D Channel, Extractor. And if you don't have Extractor, remember, that can be found here at www.finordware.com. Free. A nice person has created this amazing tool. So now that we have Extractor applied, you can see that it changed it and made it kind of darker. Under the layers option here, we'll choose one of these, and let's just choose the key layer first. So this is just the key light from above. And now you can see it's all a little dark. So one thing that you might want to do is add an exposure effect. So under Effects and Presets, you can just search for exposure, spell it correctly. Double click this. Adds an exposure effect, and we can adjust the gamma correction if we want to. For now, I'm just going to leave it at its default settings, and but it's there if we want to correct it. So I'm going to rename this one Key Light. And I'll duplicate it. And the reason I'm duplicating this one is because it already has the effects on it that we want. But we'll now change it from the extractor to the blue light. There it is. And let's rename this blue. Duplicate this one. Change the extractor to orange. There it is. Name this orange. And as you can imagine, the next thing is to duplicate it one more time, change this to green, and change the name to green. Great. So the problem is, of course, we can only see the one that's on top. So everything except for the bottom one, not the original one here that's hidden, but the bottom one of the extracted. The top three here, we're going to change the blend mode to add. And then it kind of adds up to something quite similar to what we had before. I'll go back into Maya. It's much brighter here, I think. Yeah, it's a little darker here. So this is where we can use the gamma correction and the exposure. So we may want to, let's try for the green light, change the gamma correction to 1.8, make it a bit brighter, or 2.2. Let's try 2.2 for each one. That's too bright, I think. Let's go to 1.8. These are all quite bright, actually, now that I see them. Go back to 1. Anyway, you can adjust them to get it looking the way that you want. That's the key light underneath. So that's getting pretty close. But what we have now is the ability to affect these things individually. So if you wanted to have the green light come on, then the orange light come on, then the blue light come on, or let's change that order so it goes orange, green, blue. And we can just set keys on their transparency. So we can start with them all off. I know they're still all on right now, but and if we play the animation, and you could even play around with flickering these things over time by adding a wiggle to the value of the opacity or something like that. So there are lots of different things that you can do. So I hope you find this helpful. It's a little longer than I thought it was going to be, but there are a lot of little steps and hopefully a lot of little useful tricks for you in here. And if you have to make neon lights, I hope this helps get you there. Thanks.